Good morning, everyone. We will call the September 27th Task Force meeting to order. First order of business, we'll have Shelley take the roll.
Jim Bullis, Kent Busick.
Here.
Gloria Palm. John Cosgriff.
Here.
Dan Dappert.
Here.
Christy Fremstead. Here. Tony Grinberg.
Here.
Kurt Gorowski.
Here.
Kevin Hansen.
Here.
Jeff Volk.
Here.
Bill Worth.
Here.
Second, approval of the minutes. Did everybody have a chance to read through the minutes? Any comments, suggested changes? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes. For second?
Second.
Discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign, motion carries. Comments before we get into our presentation this morning. Any comments from the task force members? Hearing none, I will just make a comment on the proposed next meeting at October 11th. I'll work with Mr. Grubb to see if we can arrange for a lunch, if that is a date that will work for everyone. What was driving that change from a 7:30 meeting is Commissioner Gehrig's request to have Bismarck officials come in and talk about their effort and their process. And so Mr. Garillo has been contacted and has reached back to us. And then Keith Hunke, who is the city administrator in Bismarck, would be available to come over on the Friday morning to present. So the two of those will be presenting. So that's the thought process behind October 11th. Think about that as we go through our meeting today, and if there's a real conflict, you know, we can rework that, but that's what I propose as our next meeting date. Mr. Volk?
Did you say Friday?
Yeah, Friday, October 11th.
That's Thursday.
Then it would be the 12th. I apologize. Be that Friday.
But for sure it is Friday.
Yep. Okay. Hearing no other comments or for the order, Mr. Costin, do you want to lead us off with your presentation?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for getting up bright and early this morning to talk about special assessments. There's nothing I'd rather do on a fine rainy day. With me today, I'm going to kick off about a little more than half of this presentation. I'm going to warn you, there's 32 slides. We'll go really pretty fast because what we're trying to do is help you to understand some of the basic concepts of the specials in Fargo, how we use them, and more importantly than anything I think of this whole presentation is the magnitude of the use of specials historically and presently. It's a very large book of business. It's actually our largest book of business in the whole city. Our capital assets, all of our infrastructure stuff is about $700 to $800 million, and a good share of that is financed by special assessments. So that's why it's such a profound book of business. With me today is Terry Heaton, if you would stand. Terry Heaton is with the firm of Springstead Incorporated. Springstead is our municipal financial advisor, and what they help us do is to issue bonds, the special assessment bonds that we do once or twice a year to fund these projects that are then paid for over long term by special assessments. So Terry and I work very closely together on bond deals. The other professional partnership that we have is with our bond counsel. Bond counsel keeps us in line with all of the minutia of North Dakota Century Code that John Shockley had shared with you at the last meeting. There was a lot of reference to state century code in all of this business, and it's very tightly prescripted by state law. There is some local opportunity, and we'll point out a couple of those as we move through the presentation. And Commissioner Grinberg and I talked about the process for you to evolve in your decision making and to try to aid that and to be helpful. We actually do have some items to consider, items to ponder, or maybe some recommendations on some things to follow up at the end. So I would hope that maybe some of the discussion might manifest near the end of our presentation. We haven't scripted it. I don't know. I hope to get you out of here by noon. So we'll get started. So with that, I think it's important to understand our city and our municipal finances, how we manage them, how we budget, what are some of our revenue streams. And I'm talking in these first couple of slides about our general fund. The general fund is where all of our major activities of a non-capital sense are accounted for. So police and fire, street maintenance, your health department, your administrative departments like the city commission, the city auditor, the city assessor, the public information officer. All of these support functions that support government are in here. So I'm going to start with revenues, and to show you that in Fargo, our revenue base is fairly well segmented. So if you were to look at this chart, you'd see, let's go to the bottom right quartile, about 5 o'clock. Property taxes, 26% of our general fund revenue comes from property taxes. And our general fund right now is about 98 million as a point of reference. We did have that footnoted, but I wanted to make the pie bigger for you, so I had to get rid of the footnote, but about 98 million. So if you go up a notch, click the blue bar, about 19 million, or about 20% of our revenues come from state and local intergovernmental revenue. So this would be our state aid that we get from the state. There's some municipal highway funds that come from the state. There are other grant programs. There may be some federal grant programs. For instance, we run our transit system off of a cost share agreement with the federal government. So there's federal money that flows in. The trends in the federal governmental revenue has been going down over the years as the feds have tightened their belts a bit. If you go into the bottom left green pie, charge for services, that's a significant category as well. It's about 16% of our budget. And in this category is the fees that are generated from this is one of our major sources. It's not all of it. This is the entire general fund all pulled together. We charge fees for our health services. We charge fees for our transit services. We've charged fees for our building permits, for our inspection functions. We have a lot of fees. And those fees are managed by local decision, local rate setting, and with the goal of keeping this entire general fund in balance on a sustainable basis. And that's really an important strategy that you need to make decisions that are long-term in nature, and you need to have the ability to sustain your operation in a carefully guarded sort of way. All the rest of the minutia off to the left and up the way, you can see there's some more or less insignificant revenues that are generated. And then near the top, transfers in from other funds. We do have the ability under state law to transfer funds from our utilities, primarily water and wastewater. And in the case of water, we can transfer 20% of our utility revenue right into the general fund. The logic of that, I believe, because of state law, is that we have a lot of non-tax paying entities in this city. So that is one way to recoup some revenue from those that don't pay property taxes. And we have used transfers consistently for many, many years. The numbers have grown a bit because we've become a regional water provider for West Fargo and Horace, and now we're going to become a sewer provider. So we have exercised that ability to increase our revenues in that way. So if you're just to mentally parse up our operation and kind of put it into 4 buckets, what I was trying to do is to show you those buckets. Now, if any one of those buckets moves around, changes for whatever reason, it may have an impact on one of the other buckets. And it all depends on the magnitude of the rate increase or the rate decrease or the movement within our state aid. In the last 4 to 5 years, our state aid, well, let me back you up about 6 or 7 years ago when the oil was first coming on board. The state aid was going up rapidly, okay, and that peaked at about $9 million, and now by today's standards, we're looking at about $6 million. So we've had about a 33% decrease in that state and local intergovernmental pie shape as a result of the money that we're no longer getting from the state. Ironically, the oil oil production is starting to ramp up again, our local economy and our sales tax is starting to move in an upward trend, which is awesome, because that's what we want to see, is sustained and controlled growth over time. So keep that in your mind as we move through some more of this presentation, because it's all interrelated. So the decisions that you're going to make here and make recommendations on may have a spillover effect into our overall operation, and I just want you to be mindful of that. So under the expenditure side too, I won't spend as much time here, but public safety over on the right-hand side, the big blue bucket, that's 41% of our expenditures, police and fire primarily. We've been adding a lot of police officers over the last several years because of crime in Fargo, and we're becoming a big city. That's a kind of a mega issue that we deal with on the budget. Down on the bottom, this general governmental category, 18.6 million, 19%. That's all those other administrative functions that I talked about that don't generate any revenue for the most part. And then under public works, that'd be streets and engineering, and then all the other functions along the way. So again, a good share of our monies are spent on protecting the community, taking care of the community, and being a good steward of the infrastructure assets that we have. And now I wanted to put them both on one sheet, because I did want to draw attention, and I apologize, the charts get a little small, so I hope you have your glasses on. The property tax on the left, the red pie, if you will, you can see that's 25 million. Okay, then go over to the right pie under public safety, that's 41 million. So our property taxes that we levy in the city of Fargo don't even cover the core costs of our public safety. And the reason that we're able to do that is because we have a very good blend of revenues. We have a variety of revenue sources. If we didn't have other revenue sources, we'd have a heavier reliance on property taxes. Other communities in the state of North Dakota have a higher reliance on property taxes than they do on a diverse set of revenues. And to go a little deeper, Jeff, you had a question?
When convenient to take a break if you're on a point.
Sure. No, feel free to interject at any time. Otherwise, I'll just keep rambling.
If I can, back on the revenue side, so if I understood what you're saying, the transfers in slice is where the fees from special assessment stuff comes in.
Okay, a great question. I'm sorry, I should have pointed that out. Charge for services down on the bottom, the green pie, that's 16% of the revenue. That's where it comes in.
Okay.
That's a subset of that revenue total.
Second question, sales tax doesn't show up on this revenue chart?
Right. Presently, all of our sales tax is dedicated to infrastructure,
Okay.
and this is our operational side of the business. And the capital side is where our sales tax monies are accounted for. And it is all dedicated to infrastructure.
One other question, I think, for this one is the in and the out for special assessment collections and debt payment and all that doesn't show up in here either. That's a whole separate accounting.
Yes, that's a totally separate set of funds. Good questions. Any other questions? And I can go as fast or as slow as you'd like, so if I'm going either, please stop me and get me on track.
I guess one quick question.
Yeah,
Is there
Dan.
any, can we get a more detailed of each of, maybe these larger pies, what makes up the 16%, or what makes up the 20 and so
Sure. Sure, yeah, we have that available, but again, I just was trying to drive concepts at this point and not so much at the detail level. We'd be happy to provide that. So, Shelley, can you make a note of that, please? So again, back to the revenues and expenses, we just got done approving our budget for 2019. And again, we think we have a sustainable budget. The revenue outlook from the state is improving, and so we do have a balanced budget. That's awesome. Here's a schedule that we put in the budget, and what this attempts to show is the changes in these revenue sources over a longer timeline. Typically, when you're doing a budget, you look at a one-year period, or and you look compared to last year, this shows multi-year, and you can see the growth in the revenues is fairly flat, at 92 million in 15 and 98 million in 19. And we also include the relative percentages. What those percentages are is that's the percentage of your total revenue stream. So we're trying to bust it up and show over time what the relative changes are. And I'll point out a couple that are probably most notable. Like I mentioned, the state and local money that we get from the state was 21.2 million in 15, and it's dropped to 19.7. That's 23% of our budget. Property taxes were 20.3 million, the top bucket, and it's up to 25.7. Now, it's a larger share of our budget, not because we're raising the tax rate, but because some of the other revenue lines are falling. And also, people that have a valuation increase of their home, they also pay additional taxes. So,
That would include new construction that comes online.
yes, new construction, new buildings, all of that all in. But the property taxes are most stable and reliable, predictable source of revenue because there is not a lot of variation in that. We have a very strong tax base that's growing, and that's good.
Question on that.
Do you have the breakout of what is for new development versus what's just increases in house values or property values?
Yeah, we do monitor that at the city assessor's level, and right now, I think for the current year statistics, if it's, I'm roughing this out a little bit, but if it's something over 5% total growth, I think about 2.8% of that is new permits, and another 2.2% in just growth in trend. How the city commission has chosen to manage that increase in valuation over the last 3 or 4 years, they've reduced the mill levy by 7.25 mills over, I believe, the last 4 years because the valuations have increased so rapidly because of our strong economy. And so what we're trying to do is manage that tax burden locally. By cutting the rate, then you're able to reduce the impact of just simply taking all that value in and taxing 100% of that value. So your commission has been very mindful of that, and this year, if we had a 5.6% increase in our tax base, the prior 2 years or 3 years prior, it was 12.5. So you get a spike in value, and you need to be thinking about how you're going to levy taxes and how mindful do you want to be about the impact of these homeowners that had increased valuations.
Kent, on the operating transfers in,
Yep.
you mentioned state law allows that up to a certain percent. Is this kind of a balancing bucket for you, or how do you determine how much you want to transfer in, or is it just a set amount, or how do you do that?
From a budgetary perspective, we have increased it over the years. In some cases, categorically, like for garbage, we just strictly take 20% just because that's how much we can take, and we build that into our budgets. We have been creeping up on our percentage in water and wastewater, and in the last couple of years, because of the revenue flat line, if you will, slow growth in revenue, we've increased those transfers to near the maximum levels. Other questions before we move? Now we're going to get into the really fun stuff, the bonding. And we'll spend a little bit of time there. Okay, so under this slide, number 6, why do we use bonding? I've listed several reasons here. I'm not going to read them all for you. You can read them on your own. A couple of key points that I want to make would be this process allows us to get large amounts of capital to build the infrastructure facilities that we're building for our growth community. If not for this, we would have to program on a pay-as-you-go basis to use the cash we have and do way less projects. We can't afford to pay for the demands for the community in cash. It just simply doesn't work. And I'll show you the magnitude of that as we get into some of these slides. We obtain very low tax-exempt financing rates. We issue bonds to Wall Street investors, and they snap them up, and we have very high-quality bonds, and so the whole process of issuing bonds and selling bonds and getting a good rate is fairly mechanical in nature, but we've had a long-standing strong reputation in the bond market, so it works very well. And the other reason I believe that we're using this, I think it's pro-development, that it allows developers to put in their infrastructure, or actually we're putting it in, but it allows developers to do their business, whether they're small developers or they're large developers or somewhere in between. They all need a source of capital, and that the magnitude of the size of our infrastructure would prohibit any one developer from being able to cash flow a lot of these projects. So we think it kind of neutralizes the playing field. It allows smaller developers to participate in our community. And then we can amortize this over a long period of time. Most of our debt is 25-year debt. If at the legislature, if you looked at that, we'll get into that, we can go as much as 30 years. And in the past task force, we went from 18 years to 25 years, 14 years ago. Excuse me. So we have made some adjustments in the amortization period. That does produce a lower impact to the taxpayer. I think when we did the task force in 2004, we lowered the tax, or the special assessment, the annual payment, by approximately 20% by tweaking the amortization period and doing a handful of other things. We actually lowered the interest rate as well. Questions on this slide? These were just ideas that were in my head. Do you have any ideas in your head as to whether you think this is a good or a bad thing, or something that could be tweaked?
Ken?
Do you really feel that it does lead to more development competition? Because I view it that there's only so many developers in town because of the cost of doing this type of project and financing, or at least the outside financing portion of it, that this doesn't necessarily bring that many more developers into the table.
Well, that's a great question. I don't talk firsthand with developers, but I think others do. I think if you talk to the development community, they would think this is very helpful. Maybe Mr. Dabbert has a comment on that.
Well,
Yeah.
the developers, yeah, they do like it because that, instead of them going out and getting outside financing from the bank or other financing party, the city is helping them out in that regard. So the developers are going to say yes, but does it really bring more developers to the table? I guess is my question.
Jeff, would you have any comments on that? You must have some insights.
I'm of the opinion it does. And I think it brings in a different type of developer, somebody that doesn't have to be quite as asset heavy. You start to think about what it costs to develop a quarter section of land,
Yeah.
and this allows the development community, I think, to be those who live with us and not those who live in another part of the country to come in and develop land around the city.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point, is that we really haven't had developers come from the outside. So if you look at the last 10 or 15 years, you and Kevin, it's been a limited pool of people that have been developing South Park.
I guess my perspective on it is slightly different, that, we're really relying on the banks to underwrite each developer, because this isn't just a blank check for any one developer to come in here. We were required to put up a letter of credit, which is 50% of the improvement district. I mean, with the new regulations in banking and everything else, in some cases, it's almost easier just to go get a loan and put a mortgage on the property than it is to get a letter of credit that's basically all other assets, because you can't even have debt on that particular piece. So while it's maybe not fostering other development type that way, I think the end result, the cost of capital, is what we should be talking about here. And the cost of capital through a bonding, low-cost tax-exempt financing, that rate is still lower than any local or national bank would be offering or extending to it, regardless if it's privately financed or municipally financed. So it isn't so much about that. I think it's bringing in large or small developers because they still have to be very financially sound. I just can't touch that rate of what the bond rate is at any local bank. And I think that's the key driver here. Plus, I'm going to even want more hate to say profit or risk reward on my investment and my rate of return that I'm not factoring in. Furthermore, I think the most important thing is, and so much of what it, in my opinion, what is driving this is the cost to the end user. And that too then is a lower interest rate on the infrastructure financing portion than it would be at any local bank where they could get a mortgage most often. Now we're maybe starting to see some of that with the yield curve and the bonding rate. It might be, that gap might be closing up a little bit, but it will still come down to their down payment on their initial purchase as well that will drive some of that stuff. So.
Mr. Chair, may I interject? This is Gloria Palm Connor.
Is that, Gloria, is that you?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Question?
We were talking about national developers not coming into our community, and I wonder if that is actually driving some of the costs of our homes up. When we have people moving in from other communities, we most often hear that our price for our home with specials added in is much more expensive than they are from other communities that they're transferring in from. And I haven't had an opportunity yet, but I'm going to talk to our MLS company that we work with that will give us a average price per home with specials rolled in. Right now, our average price per home is very consistent with the national average, but that does not take into consideration the specials that we have on top of that. So that's very concerning to me. Thank you.
Gloria, is that data that you're going to assemble and would you like to present at a future meeting?
Yeah, actually, yes, it is. I just haven't had an opportunity to meet with them. The system we have right now does not allow me to pull that average in and add the specials on top of it. But I want to talk to the company that does, and actually it's FBS in Fargo, so they have our MLS. So I'm going to talk to them locally and see if they can gather that data for us.
Yeah, I made a note for the October 12th or a future meeting if more time is required.
So that has been a concern of ours for a long time. Are our home prices higher because of how we handle specials in this community with the cities taking that over, and are we keeping competition out because of that rather than encouraging competition in our market? I can't answer that. I don't know.
I do have some data later in my presentation that may lend some details to some of those issues with regard to construction inflation, costs of the widgets and the pipes and the tubes and the paving and the asphalt. I have a cost index developed that's part of this packet that will shed some light on that. Any other questions before we move on about bonding? Has worked well in this community for many years, and we'll continue to use it. Slide 7. Here's an interesting slide, and a couple of things I want to point out is our use of specials kind of covers the map, so to speak. There's a lot of parcels here, and you look at the middle column, 6,000 to 10,000 parcels impacted on any given year. The number of projects we do in our engineering department is very large, 40 to 50 projects a year, and that's in reconstruction, and that includes new construction, both categories of our book of business, if you will, our capital plan. And that is approved and reviewed. It's developed by the engineering department based upon the needs of the community, the current assessment, their professional assessment of the quality of our infrastructure when it needs to be reconstructed and those types of things. And those decisions are made in engineering. And in finance, we follow them with bringing the money to the table with bonding to be able to keep us moving through the community. A couple of notes on the amount of, these are actually the amount of assessments levied. You'll see the trend is going up. You know, what used to be 20 million has become 40 million, and in 1 year as much as 70 million. We did have a construction peak here a couple years ago where all hands on deck and all consultants on deck and everybody was working over time to push out projects based upon the needs of the community. Jeff?
Would it be possible to get this broke into 4 categories? I kind of look at specials in 4 things. One is greenfield for the lots, greenfield to do trunk systems to get to it, reconstruction of, the smaller streets, the street in front of your house, and your reconstruction of your arterials. I'd be curious, what's the trending of those 4, if you can separate them? Now, some of them may be hard to separate, but I think that would help understand the magnitude of each of those 4.
Yeah, and I believe we do have that data.
Okay.
It'll be tabulated manually, but we do have that data. So, and that's a very good point.
Jeff, just one question about that. Would any of this money ever include any of the intercity flood protection or low mooring or anything else for any non-greenfield or protection?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Most of our, I'd say like 95% of our flood control projects have been paid for by the sales tax or incorporated into the diversion budget. With regard to the LOMR, that is a significant impact because the LOMR costs are being added to project costs, which is driving our specials prices up higher. And as we were building and moving southward, that decision was made. That's one of the things on our list to consider is, do you want to continue to assess LOMR costs? Aren't they $5,000 to $7,000 a lot? Yeah, so, I mean, if you were to remove the LOMR, that would make it more affordable, but then again, the city's on the hook to try to find resources out of one of our revenue buckets to pay for that. Once, just to continue that discussion, once the diversion is approved, does that remove the need to do lowering? Okay. So,
I mean, there's been conversation, it's just, ultimately, I think it would be a commission decision on how those requirements would change based on.
okay, so this may be still on the review list. Okay, thank you. Any other questions for data parsed perhaps in a different way? If not, we'll keep moving because I want to stay mindful of your time. How long do we amortize the specials? That's a key point. I brought that up before. I wanted to point out in the first bullet point, it is a local decision. You can amortize them over 5, 10, 15, 20, all the way up to 30, and in some cases maybe 40. So we've chosen here 25 for all the major categories, and then sidewalks and streetlights and others are lower. And the reason why they're lower is because some of those assets don't last as long as a water and a wastewater underground pipe, which might last, what, 50 to 60 years, at least 70 years. So you have some long-lasting things and others that take a faster replacement cycle. So that's what we've chosen, and this is based upon the Taskforce recommendations from the last time this was revisited in 2004. You always would have the option to lobby the legislature if you thought you wanted to do this over a longer period. It starts to drive up the cost of interest over a long period of time, but bear in mind too, people are moving in and out of our community, and so, you know, if they're paying on it and another generation pays on it, and that would be a financial decision about how you want to manage that debt that's applied to those properties. Okay, slide 9. Oops, I'm sorry for the people that didn't see the slide. How much revenue is derived from engineering and administration fees? So I'm going to start to work you through the revenue process, and this is directly related to Jeff's question about where does that revenue show up in that general fund pie. Okay, so here are our numbers from 5 million in 2010 all the way up to, I should also all the way up and then back down to 5 million in 2017. So again, there was a spike in our construction activity over the 14 to 16 period, and then 17 we had reduced capital outlay plans, so we generated less revenues. My point of this slide is that's not an insignificant revenue piece of the equation. So 5 to 10% of our general fund would be funded from this source. So again, I just want you to know that that's not insignificant. We need to stabilize our revenues, and at the end of the day, we have to balance that general fund. So
I want to, the note on the bottom included assessed and non-assessed projects. So this is a total picture. Is there information to show the difference? So again,
Well,
that becomes an issue of discussion. How big of a number is it in the assessment?
well, we assess the fees based upon gross construction cost. And so the fees are applied and shared then in accordance with the cost share policy. So if 30% of that gets allocated to assessments and the city picks up 70%, we're essentially charging ourselves fees. And again, these come out of different buckets, and it all needs to be stabilized. So it's just applied uniformly to the gross cost.
But my
Does that-
point is from special assessment projects, this isn't the number, because this is the total for all projects. Or am I missing?
Okay.
For example, your sales tax all goes to infrastructure, you said, which are projects that need engineering administration.
Right.
Special assessment projects need engineering administration. So are all of those projects rolled into this number? Or is this just from
Yeah.
those projects assessed?
Okay, I think I know where you're going. We tried to segregate these as any project that had special assessments attached to it,
Okay.
like regardless of cost share. So to try to hone in on just your specials bucket, how much is there? We do charge a fee, an administrative fee for construction administration for some of our utility projects and some of our flood projects. So that isn't shown here. What we're trying to show is, based upon your focus, here's the revenue.
So Ken, this question, the fees generated, is this a gross number, or is this looking at the expense side of the equation too? So in other words, you're generating fees and revenue from this, but you also are incurring expenses on the other side.
Yep, you're getting ahead of the presentation.
Okay.
Just a little bit. We'll get to that. And for the sake of brevity, I think I need to move a little faster. So if you have questions, fire away, but otherwise I'm going to keep moving. So again, that's our numbers. This is the slide that you're looking for, perhaps, just in a conceptual way, is, okay, so you generate a fee. How can we account for it? How can we point to one of our business functions within the city, and how does it align? And that's what this slide is attempting to do. So if we start on the left, I dropped in the fees generated from the previous slide, and then I listed our engineering budgets. This is engineering and traffic engineering, and they work on all of these projects. That's what they do constantly, is do a lot of projects. And the number of FTEs, Commissioner Grinberg asked that I put that data in there so that you get a sense of what's our workforce, how many people are working on capital projects on any given year. And you can see that has grown some. Administrative costs and the relative FTEs related to that. Again, the administration costs would be our IT services, a portion of our HR, our auditors department that keeps track of all the financing and all the bonding and all the special assessments. So clearly there are administrative costs. And this isn't all of it. Under the engineering buckets, I listed all of the budget, the entire budget, just because we're charging the fee based upon a fee policy that is applied at a %. And so we're not trying to do break-even accounting here. We're trying to apply a reasonable fee to recover our costs. And so our cost recovery rate, over on the right-hand side, you can see fairly close to 100. In years where there's a lot of projects and there's a lot of things going on, we generate more fees, and that revenue accrues back to the general fund. And in 17, when we did less projects, you can see your recovery rate is somewhat less.
I made the engineering budgets predominantly salary.
Yeah, I would suggest probably 65 to 75% salary.
Yeah. So it doesn't, it's really not a burden cost to have space, supplies, all those things you need to run staff.
Yeah, I mean, they have an operational budget that, we don't allocate the cost of the new city hall to them, we don't charge them rent, but they have operating supplies, they have navigation equipment, they have high-tech gear. All of that is, I shouldn't say all of that is in this budget. There's some capital items that they use for their business, like Trimble navigation and all of that GPS stuff. That's funded elsewhere, and that's not shown in here.
And that's my point.
Yeah.
This isn't really a complete picture of the cost to run
Right.
a group of staff. Right.
This is very crude cost accounting at this point, and we haven't got into the weeds. We can go there if you want to. We wouldn't really be real excited about it because it's pretty tedious, but we're willing to do it if that's requested. But you know how expensive GPS equipment is.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I know what the burden is on labor.
Yeah.
Big picture burden, and it's, that's why I was just curious how much it's burdened, because it is a big cost to business.
Okay, we'll jump to the next slide, slide 11. This came up in previous discussion a little bit. Here was an attempt to try to break down new projects, that greenfields type of growth versus reconstruction. And in the case of the statistics, the bold statistics, about 65 to 70% of our projects are done in greenfield areas and new development. About 25 to 30% is for reconstruction. And I think our engineers always attempt to strike a balance between the resources applied so that to make sure that we're still keeping up on reconstruction projects, and we include elements of those throughout the entire city map, so it's widely dispersed. My initial thought on this was I was trying to extract a visual of like inflation and cost increases, but this does a poor job of it, but it does illustrate where we're spending our money, greenfields versus reconstruct. Okay, now we're getting a little deeper into the weeds on this next slide. With the help of our special assessment people, Dan and Doug, who work on this stuff every day, I asked them a question that maybe hadn't been asked for a while. It's like, well, what is our inflation rate for all this infrastructure? How much are we paying? And can we do an analysis a little bit of 10 years ago, or from 2010 to 2017, get it right down to the widgets level and try to discern what's the inflation rate. So I'll break this down for you, and I apologize, it's kind of tight and it's maybe a little hard to visualize, but I'll walk you through it. So we put in water mains, we put in sewer. Each one of these boxes represents a type of infrastructure. Storm sewer, paving, those are the biggest, broadest categories of infrastructure we put in. So our engineering department keeps track of every single lineal feet, every single square yard, and every single widget of a project that is put into service. We have record of that. So Doug compiled the records, and if you, those bolded numbers on the upper or on the right side of each one of those boxes, if you were to compare a 8-inch plastic vinyl coated pipe from 2010 to 2017, it's about 60% inflation rate. Go to a 10-inch, it's 123% inflation rate over that period of time. And I just systematically picked away at some of the feet. Now this would be the installed cost that is fully loaded based upon the bid prices we receive from the contractors. That's how we track it. And so let's go down to the bottom right corner. The average cost increase from 2010 to 2017 is about 82%, and calculated at about a 10.3% inflation rate. That's fairly significant when you think about it. Is that contributing to the cost of specials? Certainly it is. So bear in mind, there is construction inflation, there is additional cost to deploy the infrastructure, and we need to be cognizant of that, and cognizant of that in our policies for special assessments. And I believe the initial shift from 30% to 50% was based primarily on trying to catch up with inflation. We hadn't done it routinely and frequently, and I think we maybe just jumped a little far.
Can you
Ken?
explain that shift from the 30 to 50%, the mechanics of that? So the city is picking up more of the specials? Is that what's happening? So
Yeah.
then that's going to be funded out of the general fund? Is that in essence what's happening?
No. The city did move their policy from what is commonly referred to as a 70-30 cost share. That means the city pays 70% of the total project cost and 30% gets assessed. Okay, and then as inflation goes on, if you don't readjust your cost index, you're going to eventually end up paying 90% and 10% because the costs are just getting more.
Well, but
Yeah.
prior to here a few
Yeah.
months ago, it was a 50-50 split?
The commission changed it to a 50-50 split about, what was it, 2 years ago?
2015.
2016. So they moved the policy in an attempt to curb the inflation. 2015. Okay, and then it takes a year to get projects designed and a year to get them built. And so some of these assessments that were coming on the rolls now just this year, citizens started to speak up about, whoa, what's going on here? These are really high. And so we did make a policy adjustment just to shift the costs.
To the 70-30?
Yes, to 50-50.
So then that 20% delta, that's going back to the general fund expenses?
No, actually, these projects aren't accounted for in the general fund, so they're not paid for by property taxes. It's in our construction funds, and the source of funds for that would be sales tax resources, utility funds, that type of thing. So when we shifted back to this policy, or actually the old policy, we had to move money, city money, into these projects to lower the cost of the assessments, and that's what the commission did.
But Don, for example, as a developer, his cost of specials in his project would drop, and the city is making up that difference elsewhere.
That's correct. Thank you for that clarification. It's important to get this right about this shifting.
No.
What?
On reconstruction.
Yeah.
Only reconstruction.
Reconstruct. Okay, sorry,
Not Greenfield.
not new.
Just quick, on this cost index, is this new is this greenfield work? Or are we mixing greenfield and
Yeah,
reconstruction?
this is a composite of everything.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, my point was, as part of this management of sustainability, we also need to be cognizant of the inflation and who's paying what cost share. And we used to manage that through a process of using a cap, which was X amount of dollars per foot. And if you don't index those caps as inflation rages on, the city just ends up eating a bigger slice of the pie. So it's, citizens complain about how costly this is and how can this possibly cost this much? But a 10+% inflation rate year over year, it really starts to add up.
And can you remind me of the discussion we had last week about how we could manage that, whether it's timing of bidding and the other options on them?
Yeah, you're stealing my thunder.
I don't want you to lose the thunder.
No, okay.
You decide when the lightning strikes.
Okay, all right. Well, let's pick it up. We got to get Terry up here, too.
Gloria, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question on this component cost. Is this material only, or does that include labor?
No, that's all in, all deployed, full labor, everything that the contractor charges us.
So we don't know if it's material costs or labor costs that's driving a portion of this increase.
That would be, well, we don't know. We haven't analyzed it on this slide. Certainly, the cost of the pipe and the commodities, that data is readily available, and somebody should be able to do the work on the labor side of it as well. But I do know this, that a private industry gets larger COLAs than government officials and government workers, so our costs would be lower than private costs. Okay. kind of a lot to comprehend in a short period of time, but I thought it was important to bring it from the big picture, how the general fund operates, and work your way into how much we use special assessments and how important it is to the growth of our community, and then walk you into the details of some of the widgets so that you have a high level and a deep level of understanding of how all this stuff is pulled together. So this was an issue of contention a while back, and it continues to come up. Again, why do we mark up our special assessments once they're bonded? When we levy them, the assessment is levied, and then once we bond them, we add 1% on top of that into the bond fund. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time on that because there's been a lot of talk about that. There's even been talk about it at the legislature, and I visited with some of our legislature representatives about it. But anyway, I wanted to walk you through real quickly, why is it there? And how did it come about? How long has it been around? So we drilled into the legislative history on this, and surprisingly, Grand Forks and Bismarck initiated this concept, and they did it because they were having difficulty paying their special assessments in those early years of the 80s. And you remember at that time inflation was raging and economics weren't so great, and it was a different time. But they worked their way through the legislative process, and during the dialogue, during the discussion at the committee level, the 2% markup was kicked around, and they had legislative testimony on it. A variety of people spoke, and they ended up saying the maximum you can charge is 1.5% over. So we know that, and that's in law. We can't charge 3, we can't charge 4, we can't charge whatever we want. We can just up to 1.5. Prior to 2004, we did charge 1.5. In 2000, the Taskforce, we lowered it from 1.5 down to 1 based upon our assessment of the community and the ability for us to sustain these debt service funds for 25 years. We're in a strong community. People pay their special assessments. We don't have delinquencies, so we felt comfortable to lower it from 1.5 to 1. Ironically, most of the other people in the state are still charging 1.5, and when we surveyed the Minnesota cities, most of them are in the 2 to 2.5% range on that. Hang on for a second. Where were we going to jump off? Okay, I got a little bit ways more to go. And so then, how do we account for debt issuance costs? Like closing costs on a house, how does that get paid? In the Century Code, in the Century Code, there's 2 options. You can either assign those closing costs directly to the assessment project and assess it directly, or you can recover those costs indirectly by using this markup to pay for it over time. So in the state law, it gives you 2 options. Charge it up front or recover it over time using the markup. That's the predominant. In our case, we're choosing the latter of recovering it through the debt service fund, and that's been our methodology for years. And just to share with you the size of the closing costs on slide 16, we just did a bond issue recently, $43 million. And our total cost, closing costs at the bottom left, 1.6% of the face value of the debt. And you can see that the parties of interest in the details of who gets the money when we issue bonds, they're all listed here. Bond counsel is our legal piece, the bond rating agency, Moody's and Standard & Poor's. They assess our credit, do credit reports to market our bonds and tell the bondholders what they think of how we're doing locally. Financial advisor, Terry's firm, helps us bring the package together to package the bonds and sell them to Wall Street. And then the underwriter's discount, these are the people that actually sell the bonds to the investors. And so they get the biggest slice of the pie here. In this case, they has over $500,000 to market $43 million worth of bonds. And so this $691,000, again, gets made up over time through the assessment process in the debt service fund. And that's maybe getting a little bit into the weeds, but it's important for you to understand the mechanics of bonding. It does cost money to bond. It's not any different than any other type of closing costs on a piece of real estate. You pay closing costs, you pay appraisal costs, you pay realtor costs at 6 to 7%, and et cetera, et cetera. So with that, I think I am just about done with my part. And talk a little bit about risk, and then that's also related to the markup. So at any point in time, if a taxpayer decides they're not going to pay their specials, and if they all did that all together and jumped off the bus at the same time, the city still has to make our debt payments every year. And right now, that's it's about $30 million a year from assessments that are collected. So we're obligated to pay that. And if we don't have the money in those funds to pay that debt, we're required by covenants to levy property taxes, general taxes, to cure those deficiencies. And so there is risk, and we're trying to show here you have economic risk, cycles of time when your economy is strong or it may be weak, and then you have natural disaster risk, and especially in Fargo we have flood risk, and we had tornado risk years ago as well. So I mean, if something catastrophic hits our community, it's important to know that we're still obligated to pay the mortgage on our community for all this special assessment debt, and it is fairly significant.
Excuse me, just one quick comment about one of the bullet points here about an example in Moorhead. I guess, due to their oversight of not having proper security with a letter of credit or anything else, I think it'd be important to note that one of the safety nets, though, is a 50% letter of credit on all developed or sold lots. It would go back if there was an economic downturn. The developer still is 50% liable for everything. So.
Right. But on the flip side of that note, the city is ultimately 50% liable on the other half. So again, my point is there is risk. When we issue bonds, we're giving our full faith and credit of the taxing power of the city to make darn sure that the investors get paid, regardless. So again, a risk. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Terry here and let her talk a little bit more through some of this. And then she did some analytics, which was kind of interesting, about various levels of this markup. And she'll walk your way through it. And if you have questions, feel free to fire them. Terry's taken one for the team. She came from Alexandria, Minnesota last night, and she hit a deer on the way. So I feel obligated to give her some good time.
And you'll return and share your thunder?
Yes.
And I feel mostly bad for the deer, just for the record. So we looked a little bit at this markup that you have, and why are you using this? So when you issue the warrants, those are all pulled together, and we finance those. We bring enough money to cover that, and then we also cover the cost of issuance with that markup. And so just to talk specifically about that, it recovers the costs of the bond issuance, and so Kent went through what those are. It's a percentage of the total. Again, if you're only issuing a $10 or $20 million bond issue, those costs are quite a bit less. It says a percentage, but that's built into that 1%. And it also acts as a contingency for things that can come up that you don't have control over. You can have someone defer or be delinquent on their assessment payments. And so it takes a while. It takes up to 5 years to get your money on a foreclosure. So someone stops paying, but the bondholders expect to be paid. You've pledged, and you've once you have tax base, you're required to do a deficiency or come up with other funds to make those debt service payments. The city of Fargo has a double A+ bond rating. That's the second highest bond rating possible, just below the AAA. Defaults are very, very rare, but because you've got such big tax base, you will be expected to do a deficiency or come up with the money if the cash flow doesn't work. So that's 5 years you could cover. The deferrals could be delayed until the property is developed or some other agreed-to timeframe, and those issues that can take a while to come in, depending on when the development occurs. And so this 1% helps you pay for issuance costs, and whatever else it can cover would help you make sure that you don't have to do the deficiency levy. So it's a little contingency, and it offsets all these risks, multiples that can happen, and protects the taxpayers. It also creates a fund balance over time so that you can, at the end of the period, and that's a GFOA best practice, to have a little excess cash as you go through for things that can come up to prevent levies or short-term borrowing. The prepayment risks and obligations. The taxpayers, the interest rate that is set on the most recent bond issue is 3.37%. And so the 1% add-on is a borrowing rate for those who are being assessed at 4.37%, which is a great rate that is provided because of the city's very high credit rating. But if it's too high, or if they can get a better rate, they have the ability to prepay at any time. The city bonds are restricted, so they have semi-annual debt payments, and it provides the bondholder guaranteed interest payments twice a year and principal payments. And most bonds have something called all bonds, except for very, very short term, have something called a call. And what that is when we sell a bond, for example, we had a 25-year bond, you aren't allowed to prepay those until year 10, typically. And so even if you have enough money on hand, you can set it aside. And the tax laws just changed. You used to be able to do advance refundings. Those are no longer allowed. So that means even if all the money came in, if everybody that you assess prepaid, it sits there for 10 years before you can actually call those bonds or call those bonds at all. And anytime after the 10 years, you can do that. So that means that once you issue the bonds, you're counting on the interest that's coming back in because the city's incurring interest on those. Bond resolutions also require segregation and the dedication of the special assessment collections. And I think the main thing to remember is when you issue debt, all the funds that are related to the debt that you've pledged, and these assessments are pledged to those bonds, they are in a separate fund. So as they're collected, they get put in a separate fund. They can only be used to pay off the debt service until those bonds are called. And one of the things we're going to talk about with the risk is their costs. Looking at this 1%, we were asked to do some analytics. The costs of these prepayments, they're trending. A lot of folks are coming up with more cash than they have in past years, and they're prepaying in this low interest because they really aren't earning much on some of their investments, so they're paying off debt instead. So we're seeing an upward trend in prepayments. So what does that do? The next slide looks at, yes.
When you say prepayments, is that of individual homeowners prepaying their assessments or cities prepaying bonds?
Thank you. The homeowners or the people who have assessments are able to pay bonds at any time.
Right.
It's the city cannot prepay the bonds until year 10.
But you
They
said
can call them is what it's called.
Right, but you said the trend is to do more prepayments. My question is that of the homeowner prepaying or the city prepaying?
It's the homeowners prepaying.
Okay.
Because there isn't a great return on their investments, so they're using the cash to prepay this debt. So the impact to the city, and we're just showing two trend lines, the yellow line reflects the rate for bonding, and it's hovering in the 4, 5, 6% range. And this is just used on an index. It is not the city of Fargo's rates. And you can see that that's what you're paying in today's market, and it's starting to shift, perhaps. But the blue line is the treasuries, and that's really reflects more of what you're able to invest. And it's trending upward, but that gap between the yellow line and the blue line is the risk to the city that they would have to cover. So if folks are prepaying, this is the yield that the city is able to reinvest the money that they collect early at. So they're investing at this very low range, but the bonds are locked in here. And so this gap becomes a cash shortfall. So they might be earning 1%, but they've got bonds that are locked in at 3.37. And
When I prepay my special, let's say, for example, that money doesn't go to the bonding company, that just goes to the city.
that's correct, up until year 10. And then they have an opportunity to lump that cash and maybe use that to call some, but it sits in the account until year 10 or the first call date. And as we said, that it's been trending upward. So the top line are all the special assessment revenues that are coming in. And this is the prepaid revenue. And so it's from 2008, you'll see that there's been some upward, and there's even some peaks that the city has had to deal with in holding this money and causing some of the cash flow shortfall. And then, of course, the lost interest earnings, because they're counting on getting on a 3.37 bond, they would have been collecting 4.37 from the homeowner through the life of the bond. When they prepay, their interest charges stop. It goes to zero. And so they're earning zero interest from that person, but they still have to pay the 3.37 on the debt. As Mr. Costin mentioned, we did some surveys with other communities, and Fargo is really at the very, very low end. You're seeing a lot of 2.5%. In fact, North Dakota is at 1%. Only the two cities in North Dakota are at 1, Edina, Minnesota, sorry. But the rest you'll see they're 1.5%, 2%. And again, they're using that for a number of things. And we're going to talk about what are they using it for besides paying for the cost of issuance. At a minimum, they have to pay for that. But there are things that come up again that are out of their control, such as prepayments, and they're using that to make sure that they have cash flow rather than having to levy. And in certain instances.
I think for the sake of keeping us on time, we want to get to the thunder part here pretty soon. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but Terry has produced 3 or 4 different scenarios of charging various interest rates and applying a couple of economic assumptions against those to see what impact it has on our ability to pay our debt. And so I think for the sake of brevity, we'll skip over that. If you have questions about that, maybe you could have a follow-up question. But I just wanted to, let's see, how many more slides did we have here? So you can see that, some of these trends as you go through here, you apply different economic assumptions against them. And we feel that leaving it at 1% is a reasonable assumption. And I think Terry and their advisors would conclude about that's a reasonable rate to sustain over the life of the debt service fund. So I think let's just jump ahead a little bit. So I'm going the wrong way, I'm sorry. And in this case, applying different markup percentages, if you dropped it from 1 to a 0.5%, the amount per month for an individual taxpayer is like $10. It's not significant when you drill it down to the parcel level. There's been some question about why do we transfer money into the general fund after the debt is paid and there's money left over in the debt service fund. Basically, it's because that's how Century Code is prescribed. We follow Century Code. The reasons are listed there, and that's why we do it. That is being debated at the legislature right now, and I think there's a couple of bills that might come up about altering that procedure, just so you're aware. So here's where I thought it would be important to spend some quality time. with regard to options to consider. And I'll go through these pretty quickly, and I think I'll just race through them, and then you can ask questions about them. Modification of the cost share and the assessment policy, that's what we just got done doing by going from what was a 50-50 cost share to a cost share 70-30 that's more advantageous to the taxpayer. Incremental adjustments to replace assessment revenue, that would be moderate shifts, if you will, from other city funds to further buy down cost share if we have the capacity to do so. Removing cost categories from assessment projects, and I cited Lomar as being one element of something that's fairly expensive at the parcel level, and that would be really a cost shift. We could simply do less capital projects and lower the homeowner share. So in other words, restrict the amount of money the city's putting in so that it goes a little farther over time, a tighter management of the number of projects we do. This next one is interesting, and I don't know how many people know this. I bet Jeff probably knows this. Under Century Code, when the engineers call for bids, they use their best professional judgment as to how much this is going to cost. Then they call for bids. They might get 6 to 8 bids on a project. And the tolerance level for rejection right now under Century Code is 40%. So if the project, if you thought it was going to be $1 million and it came in at 1.390, you could accept the bids and just move right on. So 40% delta in state law. And just from a uneducated, rational, logical standpoint, that seems like kind of a high bar. And we saw evidence of that during those early years, 15, 16, and 17, where we showed spikes in that data. Guess where our bids were coming in? 138, 139. What does that tell you? It's like the market is just pushing because they know they can. That's our assessment of market conditions. Or if they have to put their people on overtime because they've run out of resource locally and they're paying everybody overtime, they need to crank up their rates. So that might be an option. Consider reverse bidding procedures to lower bid results. This is something that nobody is doing, but when you think of the concept, if you took bids and then laid all your cards on the table and then said, okay, we got 3 hours for you to resubmit a bid, and allowed people to bid them down, that's maybe a radical concept, but something we're trying to say, hey, maybe that might work. Reverse bidding, where you don't just take one bid, you just allow it to let the market push the cost down. Don't bid projects after a certain bid date because the costs typically rise later in the construction season because everybody's busy, and that's a function of the capacity, the number of people building infrastructure. Consider passing along the interest rate savings on refunded bonds. That'd be a debt management concept where if we refinance bonds and the spread is larger, under state law, we're not required to lower the interest rate, so we don't. Should we? Could we? What impact does it have? I mean, that's all subject to discussion. Other minor items would be to seek low-interest fixed-rate loans from state agencies. There's some legislation in place right now where the state has suggested they might send some oil money our way, and that could be deployed in infrastructure. Study the feasibility of using federally subsidized state revolving loan fund loans to finance projects. Right now, there's 2 federal programs, or there's federal programs out there to take care of water and wastewater projects, and the city has used those for these larger projects, but we have not used this form of financing for core infrastructure. A little bit of a deeper dive into the way the state manages that program. There may be some opportunity to pay for paving costs at a 2% loan fixed through this program that we just recently discovered. And so that might be something to look into. And then one other thing we've kicked around for years is because we're an active issuer of bonds, this would be for the benefit of taxpayers. Why not allow our taxpayers to buy our bonds as well as a direct retail sale? If we have $43 million worth of bonds, if we carved out $5 million, set it aside and said taxpayers in Fargo or West Fargo, wherever, or in the state of North Dakota, whatever, you describe the area, but if you want to buy our bonds, it's be like an IPO for Fargo bonds. You can buy them right out of the original issue on that. So those are a few items we had, and I had hoped that maybe there'd be a little discussion around, that's the thunder, if you missed it.
So we
What-
talked about competition amongst the developers is whether that actually drives the price down. How about competition amongst the contractors? Because it seems to me that a contractor should come in and bid the projects potentially lower the cost. Do you see that?
I mean, do you see like competitors to Dakota Underground or Master coming into the community to bid projects?
It depends upon what's going on in the rest of the country. I mean, look at the oil boom years. All the contractors left, and when you bid projects, one bid, two bids. Today, what do you got? Dozen? So there's some things you can't control because you can't control.
But in today's environment right now, we seem to be
Oh.
seeing more bids.
It's crazy now.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So in theory, the
And-
prices should be coming down.
And they have.
Yeah.
They have.
And perhaps on that 140% delta there on acceptance of bids, that's probably based upon a decision about market fluctuation,
Absolutely.
and it's evidence of that in our numbers.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so you're estimating, you got to ask when was the estimate done, right? So if you got a project that takes a lot of lead time and you got that estimate out a year before you bid it, and all of a sudden the market changes, that estimate's maybe not good anymore, and I don't know if you can go back and change it, right? So there's all kinds of things you can't control in the process. But one is how many contractors are going to bid. You just can't go out and shop contractors in public bidding.
And that's regardless private or public.
Absolutely,
We just, sometimes if we do public stuff, it's a hard time even to get some bids.
absolutely. On the private sector, you big bargain, borrow and steal them, and they still don't show up to do your work. Or they say they will and won't. A curiosity I had in your Fargo bundles assessment districts and packages up one big bond for the year. In the administration, you've got a dedicated fund for each project or each bond issue?
State law allows you to aggregate individual projects into one single fund. So, for instance, in this $43 million worth of bonds, I think we had like 29 or 30 individual projects bundled together in aggregate, sold as one transaction. So we keep track of the assessments. Those 30 assessment districts all feed that one single bond fund.
And then all of those districts get treated the same as decisions are made on managing that issue.
Yes, yeah.
Looking for comment?
Yes,
The
yeah,
the reverse
question, comment.
bidding, I think, is contrary to state law.
That's why I put it on there. I think it's important at times to challenge state law. You look at some of the codification of law right now, it's so outdated and it's so, I mean, somebody needs to be looking at it, and, it's out of market, it's old law, it's not in line with how things are really functioning. So I think it's important for your committee and city leaders and others to be looking at law and challenging it.
Where I'm going with that comment is I think we need to be clear on which decisions are discretionary and which aren't. And in these conversations, it gets complicated when you start mixing them, and I think we need to keep it clear for us which decisions are local discretionary decisions, and that's one example. That should be on a list of changes that need to be made if we want to consider it versus what tools do we have today for decision-making and
Yeah, and just
Well,
to
and-
to add to that, the end game here is a report with your work, and we should have in the report kind of a spreadsheet that shows under our control, under, archaic law. I'm using that word loosely, but so that we know it, we can separate that out. Kent?
Maybe you can answer this question, Commissioner, is how handcuffed is the city because of state law? You listened to this the past 3 sessions.
It seems like you're very limited as what you can do, can't you?
Well, then then you start to get into the Home Rule Authority, and they've handed off certain powers. They're generally bestowing a large amount of power to local decision-making, but we've been snagged a couple of times on some things where we've exercised that authority, got called on it, and then had a negative impact on the city. The traffic fines is a classic example where we charge more than the state amount, but if you have an ordinance that's codified locally and it's under the provisions of your own local law, I'm not sure who's the arbitrator of where you step off of state law and when you step into local, but it seems appropriate that there should be that discussion, because I see a certain amount of flexibility and creativity opportunity. So you can either just say, well, we can't because the law is this way, so then what are you going to do? You're going to go to the legislature and hope you have a law passed, or you could exercise your home rule authority and codify your own local ordinances and say, we're going off of state law and we're going into our own ordinance structure. Now, I'm not an attorney, but that's the general sense of how that works. But you got to be a bit careful with that, because in the end, they have the ability, or somebody that's aggrieved by what we're doing has the ability to bring it up and, sue us potentially if they think we're going in the wrong direction.
Well, just to follow up on Ken's comment, your question, Kent, Blake Crosby's presentation from our prior meeting on be careful how you advance with, changing state law. And, I think it's an open book for us to look at the pragmatic side of, what's the future look like, and what's the driving force of your interest in serving on this committee is to drive down cost, right? Make it more affordable. And so if that requires, your work and our recommendations, and intertwining that with, hearing from what Bismarck's efforts have been, that gains some credence, if you will, and credibility to the effort that we'll bring into the next legislative session. And I think from my observations in being involved for a number of years, that creates momentum and rationale to influence change at the legislative level. And I would hope, and at least I've learned some things with our first 3 meetings as well. The city of Fargo manages pretty well under the requirements of state statute code as well as common business practice. Now, people have varied opinions about that, but when you look at the data, it's pretty sound and pretty reasonable. Again, that's my opinion. And so how do we position this for the next 10, 20 years? And I think that's going to involve legislative change, quite honestly. But you have to define what that is.
Yeah, but going back to the presentation from the League of Cities gentleman last time, I got the impression that, they did not want to change from what we were doing.
I would agree with that.
Let me interject for a minute, too. It's interesting. Fargo is in such a unique situation in the state. We're a very large city. We're a regional urban center. How many of those do we have in the state? Like 3, maybe 4, depending on how you count them. Our requirements for our community and the demands for sustained funding are greatly different than the rest of the state. So if you have 370 cities in the state and there's 4 that have needs that are different than the rest, it's hard to mandate your needs on the top of those 365 other cities. They're not going to like it. So there's a discussion about whether you do it locally or whether you do it legislatively, I think is really an important topic.
I think one of the things that state law could do is provide options that if you want to do specials, great. This is how we want you to do them. If you want to do fees, this is how you do them. And I think that would cover some of the issues with the sizes of all the different cities in the state. When you only have 1 or 2 options that everybody's trying to look at, one size does not fit all. That's what you're describing.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think, and I actually asked that question at a recent League of Cities meeting, we're going to be studying this issue and we're going to be studying it at depth. Do we advance an agenda that meets our needs and do it locally? Or do we push it through the legislature? And the downside of that is, you could be trying to prescribe things onto others that they don't want or they don't like or they don't need. So it's a real balancing act.
Continue.
One other quick question. Early on, you said that the public safety was the largest part of our general fund, right?
Correct.
How much of that growth is related to all of the development and increase in infrastructure that Fargo is doing? Specifically, we're going to have to, if we haven't already, add fire stations on the south side of town. We are, in my opinion, hiring policemen because we're expanding the boundaries of the city. So how much of the growth is related to all of the cost of that is related to all of the growth that we're doing versus just a more controlled growth? I mean, you described it earlier in the one slide that in 2016 or whatever year it was, I'll call it out of control, because everybody was bidding 140%, 139.9% of what they could, because if you wanted the project done, that's what you had to pay.
You know, that's a difficult question. I don't know that Fargo has ever done a study. I mean, we have analysts on board and people that do cost of growth studies, you know, like how much does this cost? And then that leads you into the issue of, do you charge impact fees to the developer to offset those costs? We don't charge impact fees, but other communities, I think, are starting to try to look at alternatives to this, much like what we're doing. I'm hearing more of it in my peers. But again, yes, it does cost more. It may not be all related to the footprint. It may be related to the people in the community and what kind of activities are going on, and just national type issues as we become a larger regional city. I get your part about the bigger the square footage, the more cops you got to have patrolling, but we don't hone in on that. We hone in mostly on crime statistics, I believe.
I actually can follow up with that. There's actually been several studies, both locally and on a national level by the National Association of Home Builders. The average return on investment, if you will, is about 3 years to the city. So with the tax base and all the other economic stimulators of any one new house, essentially all the costs or fees for that service, it's 3 years. And so from there, it's out. And we'd be happy to supplement that to this committee if anything. But we actually had one done for Fargo a number of years ago, or not that long ago.
If we were to take the, like Lomar, for example, since we've talked about that a couple of times, if we're going to take that out of the special assessment bucket, who would pay for it then? The developer,
I would suspect there would be a couple of options. One would be the city could absorb it to the best they could and just not charge it to the assessments. The other one would say, we're not going to pay for Lomar. You bought the land, elevate it to the level you want, and you pay for it and charge the homeowner for the cost of the property.
and then how many other items are there like that?
I don't know. That's probably the most significant, isn't it? Tom is our engineer. I think he'd be happy to answer
The
that.
third one would be with the conversion is Lomar required?
I would just say generally for any infrastructure, that could be the approach and that is an option that's out there today. A developer can come in and develop a land, choose to build that infrastructure on their own, and charge that price into the lot price that they sell. They don't have to special assess, it's just the majority of developers do choose to assess.
Doesn't that create problems down the road though? Let's say I self-fund my infrastructure, or let's say after 15 or 20 years, does it fit properly in with the city's plan? Do you have the same quality? Do you know?
Yeah, so we still have the same requirements. Engineering department works with them through the development of plans, reviewing those plans, reviewing the infrastructure installation, accepting the infrastructure like we would any new development project.
Don?
But just to be clear, the project and the cost of the project is, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same until it comes down. You either get a loan from the bank or you get a check from the developer, right? I mean, so if we're talking about cost savings and the fact of the input costs of the infrastructure, maybe the best I can surmise from all this, there may be a 1% savings, and that would be the bond markup, which we saw the delta is very small in that. But either way, we're paying essentially, considering we would get the same pricing from any of the municipal contractors, regardless if it's being publicly or privately bid. We still have your administration, your design, your oversight, and everything that's going to go into it, you're not going to accept anything substandard than what your already designed criteria is for a publicly accepted infrastructure. So I don't see any cost savings as to the input cost, regardless of how it's being financed. They're two separate entities. The widgets, as was pointed out earlier, are going to be the cost. There's going to be the cost regardless of how they're getting funded. So we're just debating over should it be specially assessed financed or privately financed, which in turn is then the burden is shifts from one entity to the other.
But the fee structure that we've been talking about, the add-on fees, whether it's administrative.
They're the same.
Are they the same?
Yeah, except for the 1% markup on the bonds.
No, the fees are the same, but if you moved that to the developer's bucket, we wouldn't charge a fee on that because we wouldn't have any ability to do that. So
The 1%.
we'd lose revenue by pushing it out to the developer.
Right, but my point was when we went back and we saw a nominal 15 to 22% uplift of administration, inspection, design, everything else that are over and above the input costs of the municipal contractor, all those fees for administration and inspection and everything else would remain. I would be writing a check to the city of Fargo for my inspection and design, and I'd be writing a check to the municipal underground contractor for the installation of that stuff.
So that fee would, the fee structure would be the same?
Well, it has been in the past with some minor little tweaking.
So greenfield development, when we do it in-house, design, construction, administration, survey, all of that, we charge 11% engineering. I think what Don is saying is that, so if a developer came in, wanted to do it privately, they want to hire an engineer, a contractor, do all that, we still charge a 4% oversight for our time reviewing plans and specs through project development, and then helping oversee the project through construction, and then ultimately accepting it. So that change there, that 7%, a developer is probably paying for design and construction of that project. Again, that developer might have some administration costs. We charge a 6% administration for the bond rate, for the administration of the bond over the term. Again, there's some administrative costs for a developer to do that. Again, we charge an interest for carrying costs of that project during the project development and construction. Again, a developer would have some of those same costs. So ultimately, I think that's where we're saying that there's still those markups that would essentially be built into that cost of that infrastructure.
Kurt?
I'm not sure there would even be a savings, though, because if I understood it correctly, the bond rate that the city gets for the specials is actually lower than what
Privately.
Don can go get from a bank. So if I'm a homeowner and I have to go get a loan from the bank, I'm probably going to be paying more than what the city's going to get from a rate anyways, even with the 1% mark.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that. A while back, somebody too asked, well, how many people pay off their specials in full and how many let them ride? A show of hands here, how many pay off their specials and how many let them ride? Predominantly, the answer was, I'm just going to let it ride. Because if I move out of my property, why should I pay off my specials? It all has to do with how you feel about managing money. I don't want to pay a dime of interest, so I'm going to pay the city and we're done.
Yeah, and I
Some
think a
people
lot
do
of it is the timing, when interest rates dropped down, a few years ago, there were people that had specials at 8-9% just because of past funding. So
Right.
we typically would look at a borrower and say, okay, what's your loan cost versus what's the special cost? And you do the math and you recommend to them what's the best option for them.
Yeah, in this current market environment at 3.5 plus 1, 4.5, we're right in the hunt as
Right.
far as that, but in the past, rates were much higher. I totally agree.
I think some of that depends on the dollar value you're talking. If I get a special on my house that's $1,000, I'm more likely to pay that off right away than if I get a special that's $40,000.
Yeah.
Different order of magnitude.
Well, and just one quick comment on that. Even if the developer were to pay for all that, and that was an interesting point that I wanted to bring up to Mr. Shockley's presentation, just because I were to install the local improvements does not exempt that from having special assessments next year, the following year, or the year after, or to say there isn't already some specials already on that run with that land from regional storm, arterials, trunk lines, anything else. So even if we're talking about the funding mechanism for the infrastructure, even if it's privately or whatever else, when that homeowner moves in, does not mean that there will not be any other specials already incurred or forthcoming on that property.
Okay, I'm going to suggest, Kurt had requested for some information. In the interest of time, we'll share that electronically with the city response to Kurt's questions, and then put it on the agenda for October 12th. That's okay, Kurt?
Absolutely.
And we'll also have Gloria. Gloria, if you have your information ready, we'll have that presented. If not, we can push into the next meeting.
Okay.
And we'll have the individuals from Bismarck on the agenda. And then starting from maybe halfway point, we'll have maybe 45 minutes for that. I'm just guessing here. And then we'll start our discussion from that point forward on the list that Kent provided, and other ideas in future meetings start to roll up our sleeves and figure out what direction you want to take this for later October and November. And as kind of in the original outline, do we want to have some public forums, and when we have some traction on what your direction is, then we can have public feedback on that? Does that seem like a reasonable next step? I'm hearing or seeing some nods in the heads. Kent?
Well, I just wanted to close and thank the group for the opportunity to speak and bring you up to speed on how we manage some of these things. You know, some of this stuff has been done in a disciplined sort of way for years and years and years and years. It's just, it's not that highly visible, so this deep look at all of this is really awesome. And I wanted to personally thank Terry to be coming out of a conference that's scheduled over this past 3 days to come and share time with us. I really appreciate their support. And I also want you to know that our professional teams that are out there watching over this are top-notch financial advisors, best of the breed bond counsel, and experience level at the staff. So we're doing the best we can to serve the citizens.
And then finally, anyone with public comment want to? Yes, sir. Can you come up to the microphone here? And thank you. You've been at every meeting, and you have been attentive to the work, and we're anxious to hear your comments.
Okay, thank you. I lived in Jefferson City, Missouri for 30 years. I owned a house, and never once paid a special. It can be done. Specials can be eliminated. There's a way to do it. I don't know what that way is. But I think that one of the objects of this committee should be to find out how other cities are doing this and to implement some other system than the very evil, and I use the word evil appropriately, evil specials system. It hurts old people, and now that I'm becoming one of them, I'm more tuned into things that affect old people. The other point I'd like to make is that several times you talked about the laws in the Century Code. Well, who writes those laws? Those laws didn't just magically appear. They were written by engineering. They were written by engineering companies and by city staffs, and then handed to a state senator or representative, and then they're voted on. These laws didn't originate from the people. They originated from the engineering companies who make a buck off of these special assessments. At least that's my theory. There might be other theories. And my third point, we need to get rid of special assessments in general. They're just not working. Thank you.
And sir, your name?
My name is Tim Stallman.
Okay. Thank you, Tim.
Okay, thank you for having me. I'll be back.
Other comments?
Chair,
Gloria?
yes, I just have one question of Kent, if I may. When he talks about the engineering bids go out, and many times they come in at like 138% of the project estimate, is it a requirement that when the bids go out, they give the contractors what the engineering estimates are, that they are consistent to come back at that rate? Can't they just submit it out for bids and have them bid it back at what their estimates are rather than?
Well, that's a great.
That's my question.
Is the mic on? That's a great question. The city commission ultimately has the ability to reject any bid. If it comes in at 139 and market's tight and they understand the need for the infrastructure, that's a local decision. If they feel like they're getting gouged or some other, it isn't quite right, the engineer could recommend that they be rejected. I mean, even if it was at 110%, if they saw something in the bid that was seemed fishy, they could recommend it be rejected, even if it was within tolerances. My whole point in bringing up the issue is for you guys to be aware of, at the state level, what's the worst it could be that would cause an automatic rejection without anybody having to impose their will on the contractor? Does that answer your question?
I guess Kent, my question is, when the bids go out, do you submit what the engineering estimates are when they go out? Do you submit that with it?
Yeah, I believe that's, I'll have Tom, the engineer, answer that, but I think the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. We do have to create an engineer's report, and as part of that engineer's report, we have to create an engineer's estimate, and that is public information. It does go into commission agenda, and that's done with the creation of the improvement district. And like Ken said, we had a new development, greenfield development, earlier this year. Came in about 20% over the engineer's estimate. Talked with the developer. He didn't feel that the lots would be sellable at that amount of special assessments. So we worked with that developer. We recommended denial of award. The bids were denied. Worked with the developer to talk about a different timeline, which gave greater flexibility to contractors. So we actually just recently rebid that. It ended up coming in. Engineer's estimate was the same, came in about 10 to 15% under engineer's estimate. So that is part of it too, is the time at which bids are made and the requirements working with the developer can certainly impact the cost of that infrastructure.
Super. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you on October 12th, and enjoy this historic day in the United States of America. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go into CNN and watch the live news.